Welcome to WCAT. I'm Kiki Latimer, and I'm your host for the Catholic Bookworm, where we read to learn, but we share with love in order to understand. And I'm very happy to have with me this morning Sarah Crowne. Welcome, Sarah.
Hello, thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
So I spent the last couple of days reading Sarah's murder mystery called All These Threads of Time. Really fun read with some time travel involved. Not the type of book I normally read, but I really loved it. I got into it. It was fun. So I'm happy to have you here to talk about the book this morning.
Thank you so much. And I'm so excited to hear you love the story.
Yes, good story. Do you want to start us off with a prayer?
Sure, yes. So I'd actually like to start off with the St. Michael's prayer. So in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. St. Michael, the Archangel, defend us in battle, be our defense against the wickedness and snares of the devil. May God rebuke him, we humbly pray. And do thou, O Prince of the heavenly hosts, by the power of God, thrust into hell Satan and all the evil spirits who prowl about the world, seeking the ruin of souls. Amen.
Very appropriate. So we just have our new Pope Leo the 14th.
Yes.
And that prayer was written by Pope Leo the 13th.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's also a prayer said by Sylvie near the end of the book as well.
Yeah. Yes, it is. And a good one, appropriate for a murder mystery.
Yes, absolutely. Need all the protection you can get. A murder mystery.
Great. That's great. So for our listeners, our viewers here today who don't know you, you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So my name is Sarah Crowne, and as you said, I'm the author of All These Threads of Time, which I'll hold up the book. Hopefully it doesn't blur out. And so I am an author and also a mom. I have 2 children. I'm also an attorney. I really vary across genres. So this is a murder mystery. I tend to sort of go towards science fiction and thrillers and mysteries, but I do also write poetry and a lot of creative nonfiction. I have a Substack called A Busy Lady, substack.com, where I interview other creatives, artists, writers. There's a lot of motivational and inspirational posts there as well, along with poetry and creative nonfiction. And I live in the northeast corner of Connecticut. It's called the Quiet Corner because it is very quiet here. Big news a few years ago was when we actually got a Target in town. So it's slowly building up, and I've lived here my entire life.
Well, you're not far from me because I'm in southern Rhode Island, the biggest little state in the Union. So we're probably only about 20 minutes apart, which is or a half hour maybe.
Yes.
Yeah, which is fun. So you are a busy lady.
I am. Yes.
How do you find time to write?
Yes. So it's a challenge. I absolutely won't lie about that. But I think that the most important thing is to just honestly show up and show up for yourself, show up for the story. So, I make time every morning when the house is asleep and the kids are still sleeping and, everything's quiet to get up and spend that time, first in prayer and then in writing. And, you really also have to give yourself grace because things happen, life happens. And, sometimes I literally only have 5 minutes, it could be one of those days. And there could be other days where, I have extensively longer periods to write. And it's really, understanding that sometimes, you have more time than others, but just the act of showing up really makes a huge difference. I noticed that if I showed up even for 5 minutes before my day started, it helped me feel better, that, I had showed up for the story in my dream. First thing in the morning, the story stayed with me throughout the day. So as I'm doing other tasks, I'm more likely to think about it or have my mind on it. Whereas if I don't set that intention, it can just slip away. And I think it's also important to know that sometimes, you do have those moments where you're just living life and maybe you're not writing. I definitely have had periods of my life where I wasn't writing, But, that's really where you fill the well of creativity, and good stories come from good living. So, you need that
Yeah, yeah.
time, yes, to live and experience life and, be close with your family. And, the inspiration, will come later. Also, though, with that said, I also want to say that writing is not about being inspired always. So, when you show up, there are definitely days where there's no inspiration and you might just stare at the blank page. And that's okay too. It's really just the act of showing up.
Like that when you go to daily mass, it's just some days it's just the act of showing up.
Yes,
You
that's
don't
true.
feel inspired, you don't necessarily feel anything in particular, but you show up and, just see what the grace has planned for you on a particular day. So I
Exactly.
think I read in your introduction or somewhere, maybe in your acknowledgments, that this story about Sylvie and
So,
Sebastian had been on your heart for a long time
yes.
and sort of stewing.
Yes. So it was. So how I usually approach writing and coming up with ideas is it really starts with, could be a variety of things. It could be a concept or an emotion or a theme that I really, want to portray in a story. And I write down all of the ideas. And, whether they're half-formed thoughts or fully formed ideas, I write them down. And for all these threads of time, I've always really been fascinated by time and how we experience it, how it shapes our memory and our deep longing for a second chance. And so the idea for this story really took place during the COVID shutdown. So, with the world on pause, I was really suddenly free, from the usual rush of daily life. And that shift started to make me see time differently. And
Oh, yeah.
yes, because, I normally, I used to have to, drive long commutes into the city to go to work for my attorney job. I was always, balancing that with my family. And now it was just like everything was more fluid, right? And
Right.
I
Yeah,
started,
I wrote a book during COVID
yeah,
too. All of a sudden you had time.
you all of a sudden have time. And I started thinking, what is time? And I started seeing it more as psychological than really strictly linear. And I started reading everything I could about time travel because I had come up with the idea of this story. I had written the idea down. I knew I wanted to, talk about a family that was facing a great trauma and a great grief and how they really use faith to pull them through. And I wanted to write a story with themes of love and redemption. And I thought, hey, what if I put time travel in the story? And, at first I thought, oh, that's a really silly idea. Like, no one's going to like it. Um, but I wrote it down anyway. And it kept pulling at me. And I kept going back to it. And I knew then that I had to write it. And so I started reading about time and time travel. And one book in particular that really influenced me was The Order of Time by Carlo Rovelli. Hopefully, I'm saying his name correctly, which I highly recommend. It really started to open my mind to the idea of time as more of a human construct than a measurable force. And, I just started writing down all these thoughts. The story was just tugging at me. And I knew that this would be just such a great way to show, we've all had that experience where we wish we would have done something more, someone we loved that maybe made a poor choice and we wish, oh geez, if I had been said something different or done something different, I could have helped them, or something maybe perhaps we have done that we need to come to terms with. And I really wanted this story to be about the healing and the bonds of the family and how hope and love and faith can really transcend even the limits of time. So that's what the goal was, and that's what was tugging at my heart to write it.
One of the things that I found interesting was that it was obvious you're a Catholic writer with Catholic values, and Catholicism played a role in this, not so much, overtly extrinsically, but it was very sort of background, subtle mentions of things. So how do you find sort of you're writing for a wider audience, but you're trying to put these threads of Catholicism into the story beautifully.
Yes, and I'm so glad that you got that from reading the book, because it really was my goal and it was intentional. I think it's really important not to preach in stories. I think that you need to let your characters struggle with real questions, real doubts, hope, real hope, because the most powerful stories are really grounded in an authentic human experience. And you want to invite your readers and trust them to find the meaning for themselves. And like I always say, if you squeeze an orange, you're not going to get lemonade, right? So if whatever your moral value set is in life, it will shine through organically in your work. It's really about just having that authentic, powerful story for readers to relate to, perhaps see themselves or others within it, or something they've experienced, and to be able to come to their own conclusions on their own.
So we don't want to have to have any spoiler alerts here, but it is a murder mystery, and so you have these three young people in a family. You've got June, the older sister, and then Sylvie and her little brother Sebastian. And June is murdered very early in the book, and the whole murder mystery is like, who did it. And of course, Sylvie and Sebastian, they have a really sweet relationship. You've really developed a great relationship between brother and sister, while the two girls were pretty much rivals and kind of snarky with each other because they hit that teenage thing. Sylvie still has this sweet relationship with Sebastian, as they like move into this mysterious and mystery of solving what happened to June, and can they undo it through time travel. And one of the things that you brought out that I loved was, they start to figure out that this time travel has rules. Like it's not just helter-skelter all over the place. There's rules. But they don't really know what the rules are. They're trying to learn the rules. And then you bring in the importance of writing down the rules, because if you don't write down the rules, because there could be quite a number of them, they don't know whether there's 2 rules or 50 rules when they get started. But Sebastian very interestingly realizes, like, if we don't write down what we learn, we're going to forget it. And that's a really, and that thread goes through the whole book. Because Sylvie kind of wants to say, it's not that important to write down the rules. But then she starts to realize, maybe the kid is right.
Right.
It reminded me of Moses, coming down from the mountain with the rules. God finally said, they're just not remembering the rules. It's not working out really well. I think we better write down the damn rules. And, so I just had this vision, with Sebastian, of Moses coming down from the mountain with, like, we're going to write, the rules have got to be written down because nobody seems to remember them. And that was fascinating throughout the book. That's you've got this little kid kind of pounding into his big sister, the rules, here they are. I've written them down.
Yes. I love Sebastian. He was so fun to write. And he is arguably the most important character in the story. I mean, obviously, Sylvie as the hero is very important. But he really does, pull her in, right? And remind her of the importance of rules. And, I had the rules for multiple reasons. One was really for the structure of the story. Because you really, with time travel, you need some kind of rules, right, to navigate the story and where they're going and what they're doing. But also on a deeper level, theme-wise, right? It is very important to, know your moral compass and what you believe and what you're willing to do and what you shouldn't do. And, I think that gives us a stronger faith. And I think that sometimes people think, and I think Sylvie goes through this in the story as well. Like, she says, I don't want to know the rules. Like, I just want to save our sister and just go for it and do it and not think about the consequence, right? But there is a consequence to things if you make a poor choice or an immoral choice. And you have to be, willing to accept the cost of that consequence sometimes. And if you have that moral compass and you know the rules can actually free you. You know, rules are, you know, I think a lot of times people think, oh, rules are, you know, constricting me and not allowing me to have a free life, but that's absolutely the opposite, because they give you a framework so that you can grow and you can experience life, and you can, you know, become the best version of yourself that you could possibly be.
Mhm.
You know,
I
and so,
often remind people, would you really want to drive on Route 95 with
right.
no rules?
Exactly.
Rules. You wouldn't get where you're going. The
Exactly.
rules would keep you safe. They keep you alive.
Right, exactly. And so I think that that's definitely a lesson that Sylvie learns, and she learns, you know, how to live within those rules of her new gift, to be the best version of herself, to help those around her the best way that she can.
Mm. At some point, I don't want to give too much away of the story, but you bring in the concept of self-sacrifice, that sometimes we reach a point with the rules, with how things are, where we realize that we are really going to have to give up something important, either of ourselves, something that we love, for the people we love.
Mhm.
Mm.
Absolutely. And that was really something that unfolded for me writing the story. I did not know the ending at first. And as you know, I was structuring the story. I structured the entire story out before I actually wrote a page. And I started to see that she would need to make that self-sacrifice, that that was what she, you know, needed to do. And of course, we don't want to give anything away.
Yeah.
But I almost gave it away. But, you know, it really, you know, the theme of the novel is asking, how far would you go to save those you love? And what does that look like?
Another huge theme of the book is this concept that when something bad happens, when someone sins, when there's really an objective wrong done, it's usually not in and of itself. It doesn't, bad things, in other words, don't happen in a vacuum. There's a cause. And sometimes there's an immediate cause, but then there's a cause of that and a cause of that. But you can usually sort of follow things back to finally you get to a root cause. Um, and
Yeah.
that theme runs through the book, like, especially says, well, that's an immediate cause, but we need to find something that's deeper, that all of these bad things are happening. We need to find the root cause of things. We need to go back farther to find out where it's all coming from. And of course that's such a Christian theme of, fallen human nature. You get to follow it all the way back. And the idea that you have to, Bishop Barron talks about this concept of, in the Old Testament, the idea of having to root out all of it. You got to get to that root. You can't just keep chopping off the plant.
Yes, exactly. And that was really important for me in writing this story, because I wanted the opponent to not just be, you know, obviously he's making very immoral choices, he's a murderer. But I didn't want just, oh, here's this evil villain without any root cause of, how did he become that way? Or what happened to him? Or where did that come from? And, Sylvie and Sebastian are constantly throughout the entire novel, before they know who did it, they're constantly looking for that root cause to stop the murders from happening, to stop their sister from being murdered, to find their father. Why did he mysteriously, disappear the same night that their sister died? And, they want to fix it, right? But I feel like Sylvie, she comes to that point where when she knows the root cause and she tries very hard to save the villain and just can't. Sometimes, you know, people make choices from experiences or darkness that's within them or things that they've been through. And, you can't no matter what you say, right? You cannot necessarily make them make another choice. They have to experience life themselves and make that choice. And it's very much a tragedy in that way because, we see, and again, I don't want to give out too much of the book, but we see the villain in different, we see him as the villain and we see him in another part of his life, right? Where, you think, how could this person become this, right? Eventually, and you see how evil can, really grow and like become it is a disease that will grow and just take over someone's spirit and soul without, again, that moral compass, right?
Right.
And I truly believe, that at any point, you know, another choice could have been made, and then how far back does that root cause go? Because if you having read the story, if you think about what the final root cause is, well, but what was the root cause of that, and what was the root cause of that?
Right.
Going all the way down, and
Right.
it's you have the choice to have your faith, to turn to God, to try to make a more positive path, or you can let it swallow you up and turn you into something that you were never meant to be, or that God never meant for you, if that makes sense. So I really wanted, like I said, I didn't want just, oh, here's the villain. I wanted to make it more complicated than that, because I think that life is complicated. And I think it's important to not be afraid to, look at all of these themes that are explored in the book, because, only, I think that Sebastian says it best when Sylvie says, how do you stop a shadow? And he says, flood it with light. So the more light that we put on things, right, the more that we can learn and grow from it, and we can shine the
Now,
light.
when I looked for the book on Amazon, I was very surprised to see that they said this was for 12 to 18-year-olds. I just want to mention to people who are listening, this is not for 12-year-olds unless somebody's 12 going on 30, or mom and dad or somebody's reading this along with young people. I would certainly say 14 and up. I don't know. There's adult themes in the book. I mean, nothing explicit, but there's murder. And I want to ask you, there's a number of unexpected, unplanned pregnancies of young women. And there is the theme of the word isn't actually pedophile, but pedophile and grooming of young women by someone, an adult male in the book. So there's adult themes in the book. I think they're really well handled. I think you did a great job dealing with them. But I just want to mention that don't listen to Amazon on the 12-year-old.
Amazon has its own version of how to, give ages, and you're kind of stuck with the window that they give you. I mean, when I wrote the story, I really wrote it as a universal story. And I'm really glad that you brought this up, because I was actually talking with some librarians, young adult librarians, who had also reviewed the book, the KPL Lit podcast. I'll give them a shout out. And something that they had said was that, yes, there are these very adult themes. And exactly as you said, they're dealt with in the best way possible. And that if it is, a 12 or a 13-year-old, it would be important for a parent to read perhaps with them and talk about these things age appropriately, and in a way where, to know that these things can happen, or how they can be safe from it happening to them. I think that is an important conversation, because especially, I'm always drawn to themes of these sorts of things happening with people you trust, or people that you wouldn't think, oftentimes, at least for me, I was a child of the 80s, right? So growing up, I always heard, stay with me right here in this aisle. You never know, some stranger from the abyss is going to come out and take you. And, kids on milk cartons and, all of this, which is very scary and very real and awful. But it was very rare for, adults, at least in my life, to say, hey, it could be a teacher at school or your neighbor next door or, an uncle or a bro, whoever. And
Right.
so,
Uncle Joe,
right,
it's,
right. And
no one ever talked about Uncle Joe, but
nobody
everybody knew
talks
he was
about Uncle
scared of,
Joe.
It
Yes,
was
exactly.
like,
So I
yeah.
agree. It's definitely, it's not a story to just give your 12-year-old to read on their own. But if you want to talk about, you know, how to protect yourself or these, things to look out for, I think it could be done in an age appropriate way. But all in all, I feel like the story doesn't, even though those themes are there, it's not the sole focus. And it's
Mm.
really altogether more about beauty and redemption and love for family and that strong sibling bonds as well.
Just going back to that theme for a minute, because it's a beautiful book and there's just a lot of, like flood the light in the darkness.
Mhm.
But, as much as I want to say like, okay, this isn't a book for, an 11, 12-year-old
Right.
to
Yeah.
young woman to be reading. At the same time, in my own life, in the lives of sisters, friends, girlfriends that I grew up with, the grooming of young women.
Yes. Are you still there? You froze a little bit.
It's a good conversation to have with young girls, that, are off out there with, teachers, scout leaders, anybody, just alone with somebody who's befriending them and at times, God forbid, but inappropriately befriending. It happens to boys as well. Obviously, we've learned the hard way.
Yes.
But yeah, I remember in my family, my mother, we had Uncle Bob, what was his name? I don't remember, in the family, a friend of the family. And my mother was, concerned about us girls, the two
Yes.
girls. And it wasn't until years later she realized, oh, it was my brother she needed to be worried about, not us. But there were other situations of friends of the family, and the whole grooming thing of gifts being given,
Yes.
that's just such a thing that just happens with someone who's grooming a young person for sexual favors. So while I don't recommend the book for 12-year-olds, I certainly
Right.
recommend the conversation for 12-year-olds, because that's who's being targeted, usually just prepubescent girls, boys. So we need to be aware of it. The conversation needs to be had in families. I think your book is a good introduction if a family were reading it as a family. Homeschoolers out there, you deal with things, like I said, with appropriate language, inappropriate stuff with appropriate language.
Appropriate language said in
Yeah,
the best possible way without being,
so I
graphic
had
or
to,
going into it.
yeah, so you did a great job with that. What made you decide to have the pregnancies in the book? That was a question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So as I said before, I structure everything before I write it. So I've studied writing for many, many years. I started at the UCLA Writers Program, and then for the last 8 years, I've been mentoring under best-selling author John Truby, who wrote The Anatomy of Story and The Anatomy of Genres. And so I spent probably the better half of a year and a half um, planning this story. And when I plan stories, it's not necessarily an outline, right? Where there's just plot points and I think, oh, this is going to happen, that's going to happen. It's more that I delve deep into the theme of the story. I look at the hero and I say, what does the hero want? What is their need? What is their weakness? I have, a solid premise for the story. I knew it was going to be a murder mystery. I knew that her sister would be murdered on homecoming night. I knew there would be time travel. But then how will I execute that? And something that happens in part of that process is that, we often as writers, and it's also very important to understand the character's journey, but we also often forget about the opponent. And the opponent really drives the story. And, the more the opponent drives the story, the more opportunity the hero has to rise and to make that great moral choice, right? And to really show that theme. And so I had to spend time delving into the opponent and why he was doing what he was doing and what made him that way. And it's not necessarily a fun place to be because I didn't want to, have to think about this serial killer and figure out why, he, was doing what he was doing. But what really held me through that was that, I knew that understanding that and understanding his attack on the hero and his attack on everything that she loved would give her that opportunity to, make that moral choice and to rise even greater and to show the power of love and redemption. And so through that process, I started realizing that, and again, I don't want to give away the story, that he had some deep-seated childhood things that happened to him. And that was really driving it forward. And so then I looked back at the victims that I, knew, her sister and other victims in the story. And I knew I needed a common thread that tied them together. And his trauma and their choices sort of melded together, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And that's where that really came from. That was the starting point of having the unplanned pregnancies.
Fascinating. I want to bring up just one more thing. I know we don't have too much more time, but the concept of of controlling emotions. Sebastian, sort of sees this, that they have to control their emotions, that Sylvie has to, in order to time travel and do it well and get where she wants to go, she has to be able to control her emotions. And the controlling of emotions is really a virtue. We're not born controlling our emotions. And many, never learn to control their emotions, especially like the bad ones, envy, anger, things like that, fear, they can sort of rule your life. Obviously the killer, they rule his life, her life, her, I don't want to say who it is.
Yeah, it could be.
Their life, and emotions can ruin our lives. And the development of virtue through grace, we can't do it on our own steam. We can try for a while, but it's not usually very successful. Jesus said, apart from me, you can do nothing, nothing good. And so the importance of controlling emotion in order to be happy in life and to see what, Sylvie wants to do the right thing. She wants to do the right thing. And in order to do that and to see it clearly, to be prudent, which is, of course, in one of the virtues, there is, the controlling of the emotions, because our emotions just wreak havoc on our lives, left to their own devices.
Yes. Yes. No, absolutely. I think that's a huge lesson that Sylvie learns, right? Because when she allows her emotions to just take over everything, she reacts very differently. I mean, not just with time travel. If you, think even to the first chapter, there's a lot of very deliberate things in that first chapter to show that she's really, wallowing up in her grief, and she's, yelling at Sebastian, and it causes the vase to fall. And, she's arguing with her sister and then feeling awful about it later, right? Going into the garage when she has a conversation with her dad that I think is very sweet and special. I love that moment that they share in that first chapter. And, she's really just sort of being a teenager and just living from a selfish way of thinking of just how she feels or what she wants in that moment, and not really considering the consequences of what she says or what she does. And I think that, so her time travel ability, we can give this spoiler alert that there's no time machine in this book. So it is more of a superpower. And she's able to time travel through time and space, really just with the power of her heart and the power of her mind to place her there. And often as we do in mass, right? I mean,
Mm.
if you think about it, mass is like a time travel where,
Mm.
we're participating in the Last Supper. And so, and that was really a huge inspiration for me in Sylvie and the way that she time traveled. It's like almost, she's really time traveling, but it's almost like a meditative prayer in the way that she does it. And with that being said, when her emotions are ramped up and she's not able to calm herself or really set an intention of, what it is that she's trying to do or accomplish or where or when she's trying to go, her ability doesn't work well, right? It ends up becoming flawed and it ends up causing issues. But when she's able to separate herself and say, okay, I feel all these things, um, I'm upset, I'm scared, I know what it is I have to do, but I'm going to be brave anyway. I'm going to take the deep breath. I'm going to, pray. I'm going to have faith and I'm going to make this decision and I'm going to travel, to this spot. And she gets better at this as the story goes on to, try to set it right. And of course, there's a whole bunch of things that happen throughout that because it is time travel, right? And, all these threads of time, every choice, for every choice, there's a consequence and there's a reaction to that. And it's really her journey of navigating those choices and what it means to really be selfless. Because that's really, I feel, what she learns at the end is, through love to be selfless for her family and to do what it takes to help them and save them.
Well, I think you've written a wonderful book, Threads of Time, all these threads of time. It was really delightful. We've kind of meandered around here. Is there anything that you want to mention that we didn't get to that's really important to you for people to know without giving any more of the story away? It's a fun story. It's
Oh,
beautiful.
thank you. I mean, I would just like to say that, I truly believe that stories have the power to inspire and to heal and to bring hope. And that's so important, especially in a world that just feels so chaotic. I just feel like that storytelling really matters. And that's really my goal as a writer, is to write stories that do not shy away from tough topics, but that do bring themes of faith and redemption and love, and hope into them, to show, people going through really tough times, but how they can overcome it with faith and with grace. And, I just feel like if even one person feels seen or encouraged, because of something I've written or, because of another book or story that's out there, then it's all worth it.
Beautiful. Do you have something else you're writing at the moment?
I do. So I have so many projects in the works. So first, I'm really excited that All These Threads of Time is actually coming out as an audiobook very soon. So depending on when this is published, so it's probably around 10 days from today. We just finished recording. It's just going through the process of being approved. So that's awesome because you can really, experience the story in a different way. I worked with a voice actor. She really brought a lot of depth and emotion to the story as she told it. So it's really exciting it was exciting for me to listen to the story. I think it's the closest I'll ever get to experiencing it as a reader. Because, when you've structured it and you've written it and you've looked at it,
Great.
thousands of times, you start to lose, the feeling of the story. And so hearing it from someone else is really pretty cool. So
Yeah.
I'm also finishing up my latest novel, which is called Tune In. I have 2 chapters left for that, and I'm really excited about it. It is a young adult science fiction thriller, and it is about a telekinetic pop star and her investigation into her mother's sudden death, which ends up leading to a deadly conspiracy and a past that she never knew she had. But like all these threads of time, there is a very strong sibling bond, very strong, you know, family ties and love. And it really does talk about those questions of redemption and, accounting for our past and how we can make better choices going into the future. And so I'm also, there's definitely a lot of Christian themes woven throughout that story as well. And so I do expect that to be released probably early fall. And then I also wrote a book called Rebel Writers, and it's where I tour historic homes of famous authors. And I started off on this journey of I discovered that I'm related to a bunch of writers, and I was so excited. I learned I was related to Nathaniel Hawthorne and Mark Twain and Tolkien, who are all distant cousins in my family tree. And I thought, oh my gosh, this is so cool. So I started, visiting their homes, never imagining it would turn into this whole journey. And the more I learned about their lives, the more I learned what it really means to be creative and to be brave and to share your story or your talent with the world, and how God really calls us to share our talents. And sometimes we don't want to because we're afraid, of what people will say, or they'll judge us, or they won't like it. And so I ended up writing a book called Rebel Writers, where I take you through the journey of each writer and the trials and struggles that they had. And then at the end of each chapter, there's inspiration of what we can learn from their lives and how we can be inspired in our own lives to shine our gifts upon the world as well. So volume 1 is out now, but I'm finishing up volume 2, which I hope will have many writers. Edith Wharton should be in it, Ernest Hemingway, and a bunch of others. So I'm very excited about that. And last, I am also working on a fantasy series, which is in the very early stages, and another mystery as well.
Wow, you are a busy lady.
I am a busy lady. I'm just truly excited to keep growing as a writer. I'm just so inspired by, the gift that God has given me. I've always been a writer. Before I could print, I was making up stories. And, my mom used to keep a radio on her kitchen counter. And she, this is the 80s, and that was the only way you could record a song, right? You had to wait for it to come on the radio. And she'd always have a blank tape there. And I would pull up the chair and record all my stories onto it. So my poor mom, looking for like the latest hit, and there's my, story there. So, I'm just really excited to share that love of story with the world. And I really hope that it inspires others.
That's awesome. Well, I loved all these threads of time. Where can people get the book, Sarah?
Yes. So several places. They can get it at Barnes and Noble. You can also get it at bookshop.org to support indie bookstores. Of course, it's also available on Amazon. It can also be found direct at my website at sarahcrownebooks.com. So yes, it's available in many places.
Great. Well, it's wonderful. Recommend it. Just fun read. Really, I don't get to read novels very often, so that was fun too. It's been a while. So thank you. Thank you so much. Why don't we end again with the St. Michael prayer?
Sure, absolutely. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Saint Michael the Archangel, defend us in battle, be our defense against the wickedness and snares of the devil. May God rebuke him, we humbly pray. And do thou, O Prince of the heavenly host, thrust into hell Satan and all the evil spirits who prowl about the world, seeking the ruin of souls. Amen.
Amen. Thank you so much. Stay in touch, please. I'd love to do another interview in the fall when your next book comes out.
Oh, thank you so much. I'd love to be here. And thanks again for having me. It's been a real pleasure.
It's been delightful.